James adjusted his hoodie and stepped onto the dimly lit subway platform, the cold air brushing against his face. It had been a long day, and all he wanted was to sink into a corner seat and tune out the world. The train screeched to a stop, its metallic doors hissing open. He stepped inside, finding the usual mix of late-night commuters, some lost in their phones, others staring blankly at the graffiti-covered walls. The faint hum of the train moving through the underground tunnels filled the air, creating a rhythm that could almost lull anyone to sleep. But something was different tonight. James could feel it in the air, something tense, something wrong. His eyes swept the carriage, and that's when he saw her. An elderly woman, clutching a worn handbag, entered the train with small, deliberate steps. Her face was kind but weary, and she clung to the metal pole for balance as the train jolted forward. No one offered her a seat. Most passengers didn't even look up. James clenched his jaw, debating whether to stand, but before he could move, someone else caught his attention. A young man in a dark hoodie, sitting near the doors, shifted in his seat. His sharp eyes darted between passengers, calculating, scanning. James had seen that kind of energy before, restless, opportunistic. The young man's gaze locked on the old woman, and James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The man stood up, moving closer to her, and James leaned forward slightly, his instincts screaming at him to stay alert. The train slowed as it approached the next station, the screech of brakes filling the silence. The young man took another step toward the old woman, his posture casual, but his intent unmistakable. James's pulse quickened. He could see the tension in the woman's shoulders as she shifted her bag closer to her chest. The doors opened, and a few passengers exited, but no one seemed to notice what was brewing. Or maybe they did and chose to ignore it. And then it happened. The young man reached out, his hand brushing against the woman's bag. She flinched, her eyes wide with shock. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice trembling, but he didn't back away. Instead, he smiled, a cold, smug smile, and leaned in closer. James's fists clenched as he stood halfway up from his seat, unsure if he should intervene yet. The rest of the passengers sat frozen, some pretending not to notice, others pulling out their phones, their faces a mix of fear and morbid curiosity. James took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his ears. He knew this was one of those moments, one where every second counted, where doing nothing would mean letting the wrong thing happen. But before he could take another step, the young man made his move, and the train doors slammed shut behind them, sealing them in together. James's eyes locked onto the man, and a quiet but unshakable resolve took hold. This wasn't going to end the way the young man thought. Not tonight. The train picked up speed, the dim fluorescent lights flickering above, as James prepared to act. James didn't take his eyes off the young man. The train rattled through the tunnel, the fluorescent lights flickering as if unsure whether to stay on or give in to the darkness. The old woman clutched her bag tightly, her knuckles white against the worn leather straps. Her gaze darted around the carriage, searching for someone, anyone, who might step in. But most of the passengers had already turned away, pretending to be absorbed in their phones or the blurry view outside the window. The air in the subway car grew heavier with each passing second, and James could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The young man shifted closer to the woman, his grin still plastered on his face. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile people wore when they thought they held all the power. He leaned in slightly, his voice low but loud enough to carry over the hum of the train. "What's in the bag, Grandma?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost taunting. She flinched at the question, clutching her bag even tighter and taking a small step back. James scanned the carriage again, hoping someone else might stand up or at least say something. But the other passengers remained silent, their heads down, avoiding eye contact. James's mind raced. What if this escalated? What if the young man decided to take more than just the bag? He glanced at the old woman again, her trembling hands clutching the straps like they were her lifeline. That bag wasn't just an accessory. It was important to her, maybe even all she had. The young man took another step forward, his confidence growing as he noticed the lack of resistance from everyone around him. "Come on," he said, louder this time, his voice laced with mockery. "You don't need all that junk. Just hand it over." The woman shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. She didn't say a word, but her stance was defiant in its own way. She wasn't going to make it easy for him. James felt his muscles tense as he watched the scene unfold. Memories from his past began to surface, moments he had tried to bury. He had seen situations like this before, ones where people stayed quiet, hoping someone else would step in. He thought about his younger self, sitting in a crowded cafeteria while a kid 2 grades above him bullied another boy. He hadn't done anything then, and the regret had lingered ever since. That same feeling was creeping in now, but this time, James wasn't going to let it take over. He had promised himself a long time ago that if he ever saw something like this again, he wouldn't just sit and watch. The train jolted suddenly, throwing everyone slightly off balance. The young man grabbed the metal pole to steady himself, but quickly returned his attention to the woman. He reached out again, this time brushing against the bag more forcefully. "I said, hand it over," he demanded, his voice losing some of its playfulness and gaining an edge of impatience. James stood up slowly, his heart pounding. He could feel the stares of the other passengers on him now, a mix of curiosity and relief. They weren't going to stop the young man, but maybe this stranger, this guy who had finally decided to stand, would. The young man turned his head slightly, noticing the movement. His expression shifted, the grin faltering for just a moment before being replaced by something colder. "Got a problem?" the young man asked, his eyes narrowing as he looked James up and down. His voice carried a warning, a challenge. The old woman glanced at James, her face a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't say anything, but her eyes seemed to plead with him, begging for someone to end this. James didn't answer right away. He took a step forward, closing the gap between himself and the young man. The train hurtled through the tunnel, the sound of its wheels grinding against the tracks growing louder. Every passenger in the car seemed to hold their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. James felt his pulse quicken, but his expression remained calm, his voice steady as he finally spoke. "Leave her alone," he said, the words cutting through the tension like a blade. The young man's grin returned, but it was different now, forced, uneasy. "Oh yeah," he said, trying to sound confident. "And what are you gonna do about it?" James didn't answer, but his silence was louder than any threat he could have made. The subway car rattled on, the fluorescent lights flickering again as if the train itself was holding its breath. The young man glanced around, his bravado slipping as he realized he no longer had the crowd on his side. James took another step forward, his eyes locked on the man in front of him, refusing to back down. The young man's confidence wavered, but he masked it with a loud scoff, taking a step back. He looked around the train car as if searching for backup, but no one made a move. The passengers avoided his gaze, their heads still buried in their phones or fixed on the grime-streaked windows. Only James stood firm, his shoulders squared, his eyes locked on the man. The air in the car felt thick, every sound amplified, the creak of the train's wheels, the faint buzz of the lights, even the shallow breaths of the woman clutching her bag. "Man, you don't want to get involved," the young man said, pointing a finger at James. His voice was steady, but his hand trembled slightly, betraying his bravado. James tilted his head, not saying a word. He had learned a long time ago that silence could be more intimidating than threats. The young man sneered, stepping closer as if testing James's resolve. "What, you think you're some kind of hero?" he asked, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of a few passengers. James's jaw tightened. He wasn't a hero. He didn't think of himself as brave or fearless. He was just tired of seeing people like this young man get away with their actions because everyone else was too scared to step in. He glanced briefly at the elderly woman. Her wide, teary eyes were fixed on him now, and for a split second he could see the gratitude in them. That look alone was enough to remind him why he couldn't back down. "I think you should let her be," James said, his voice calm but firm. He didn't raise it, but it carried weight, slicing through the noise of the moving train. The young man stared at him, the muscles in his jaw twitching. He was cornered in a way he hadn't expected, not physically, but by the sheer presence of someone who wasn't afraid to challenge him. Meanwhile, the other passengers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Some looked relieved that someone else had stepped up. Others seemed uneasy, as if unsure whether they should support James or remain uninvolved. One man in a business suit shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting between James and the young man. A teenager sitting near the doors whispered something to his friend, their phones angled discreetly to capture what was happening. The glow of their screens reflected off their faces, the unmistakable sign that they were recording. The young man noticed this too, his gaze flickering to the cameras for a moment. He smirked, trying to save face. "You all see this guy," he said, gesturing toward James. "Thinks he can tell me what to do." His voice was louder now, meant to draw attention. But James didn't flinch. He just took another step closer, shrinking the space between them. "Last chance," James said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but the seriousness in his tone left no room for interpretation. "Walk away." For a moment, it seemed like the young man might listen. He glanced at the bag still clutched tightly in the old woman's hands, then back at James. His fingers flexed at his sides, his mind clearly weighing his options. But instead of backing down, he laughed, a short, sharp bark that echoed in the confined space. "You really think I'm scared of you?" he said, his grin returning, but it didn't reach his eyes. The train jerked slightly as it rounded a corner, sending a ripple through the passengers. The old woman stumbled but quickly caught herself on the pole. James instinctively reached out to steady her, and in that split second, the young man seized the opportunity. He lunged for the bag, his hand wrapping around the worn leather strap. The woman screamed, holding on with all her strength, but the young man was stronger. The strap began to tear, the seams stretching under the pressure. James reacted immediately, grabbing the man's arm and yanking him backward with a force that surprised even him. The young man stumbled, nearly losing his balance, and the bag slipped from his grasp. "Enough," James said, his voice cutting through the chaos. His grip tightened on the man's arm, his eyes narrowing. The young man struggled for a moment, but James held firm. The train began to slow as it approached the next station, the screech of the brakes filling the air. The tension in the car was palpable, every passenger watching now, their breaths held as they waited to see what would happen. The young man jerked his arm free, glaring at James. "This isn't over," he muttered, his voice low and venomous. He glanced at the doors as they slid open, the cool air from the platform rushing in. For a moment he hesitated, his eyes darting between James, the woman, and the exit. Then, with a frustrated growl, he shoved past James and stormed off the train. James exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. He turned to the woman, who was still clutching her bag, her hands trembling. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice too shaky to respond. The train doors closed with a hiss, and the subway car jolted forward once more, carrying its passengers deeper into the city. But the tension lingered, and James knew this wasn't the end of it. As the subway car rattled forward, James sat back down, his heart still pounding from the confrontation. The elderly woman gave him a faint, grateful smile, though her hands hadn't loosened their grip on the bag. Around them, the passengers were beginning to return to their routines, some still whispering about what had just happened, others pretending as if nothing unusual had occurred. But James couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. His suspicions were confirmed when the train pulled into the next station. The doors slid open, and a few passengers stepped out, replaced by a handful of new ones. Among them was a man who immediately caught James's attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. His movements were deliberate, his eyes scanning the car as he stepped inside. There was something about him, something unsettling. He wasn't just another commuter. James's instincts flared as the man's gaze locked onto the elderly woman. It wasn't a casual glance. It was purposeful, calculated. The man adjusted the strap of the duffel bag slung over his shoulder and moved to stand near the doors, leaning against the pole as the train lurched forward again. James watched him carefully, his pulse quickening. He couldn't be sure if the man was connected to the earlier incident, but the timing felt too coincidental. The old woman seemed to sense it too. Her posture stiffened, and she clutched her bag even tighter, her eyes darting toward James for reassurance. He gave her a slight nod, silently promising he wouldn't let anything happen to her. But the tension in the air was undeniable, and James knew he had to stay on high alert. As the train sped through the tunnel, the man reached into his duffel bag. James tensed, ready to act, but all the man pulled out was a phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then glanced at the woman again, his expression unreadable. James couldn't tell if he was being paranoid or if there was something deeper at play, but every instinct he had screamed that this man was dangerous. The train began to slow as it approached another station, and the man pushed off the pole, moving toward the center of the car. His steps were slow, deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The elderly woman shrank back slightly, her eyes wide with fear. James stood up again, positioning himself between her and the man. "Can I help you with something?" James asked, his voice steady but firm. The man stopped, tilting his head as if sizing James up. For a moment the two locked eyes, and the air in the car felt electric, charged with unspoken tension. "You've already helped enough," the man said, his tone calm but laced with something unsettling. He glanced at the woman one more time before stepping back, holding up his hands in a mock gesture of surrender. "Relax, I'm just riding the train." James didn't move, his eyes never leaving the man. He didn't trust him, not for a second. The train doors slid open, and the man made no move to leave. Instead, he leaned casually against the pole again, his eyes scanning the car as if taking inventory of everyone inside. The train jolted forward once more, and James felt the unease ripple through the passengers. This wasn't just about the old woman anymore. Something bigger was unfolding, and James had the sinking feeling that he was in the middle of it. He glanced at the woman, who was now staring at her bag with a troubled expression, as if debating whether to say something. "What's in the bag?" James asked quietly, leaning toward her. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line before she finally spoke. "It's nothing valuable," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Just some personal things. Family pictures. Papers." But the way she avoided his gaze told James there was more to it than that. The man in the dark jacket seemed to notice their exchange. He smirked slightly, pulling out his phone again as if texting someone. James's stomach churned. Who was this guy? Was he working with the young man who had tried to grab the bag earlier? Or was this something entirely separate, something far worse? As the train hurtled toward its next stop, James realized the stakes were higher than he'd thought. Whatever was in that bag, it wasn't just important to the elderly woman, it was a magnet for trouble. And now, James wasn't sure who he could trust or what was coming next. But one thing was clear, this ride was far from over. The train screeched to a halt at the next station, and the air inside the carriage felt suffocating. James stood firm, his eyes locked on the man in the dark jacket. The elderly woman fidgeted nervously with the straps of her bag, her breaths shallow and uneven. Around them, the passengers shifted in their seats, sensing the tension but still unwilling to intervene. The man's casual demeanor didn't fool James for a second. There was a purpose behind his every movement, and James was determined to find out what it was. As the doors slid open, more passengers shuffled on, but the man didn't move. Instead, he stayed leaning against the pole, his eyes darting around the car. James noticed his hand slipping into his pocket, and his heart raced. Was he reaching for a weapon? A signal to someone else? James clenched his fists, ready to act, but the man simply pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, as if deliberately drawing attention to it, and held it up just long enough for James to see. It was a photo of the elderly woman, younger but unmistakably her. The man glanced at James and smirked before slipping the paper back into his pocket. James's stomach dropped. This wasn't random. This woman was being targeted for a reason, and now James had no doubt that the man and the earlier young thief were connected. The train started moving again, and James leaned closer to the woman. "I need to know what's going on," he said in a low voice. "Why is he after you? What's in the bag?" She hesitated, her eyes welling up with tears as she clutched the bag tighter. It's my husband's journal," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rumble of the train. "He passed away years ago. He worked on sensitive projects before he retired. I didn't think it mattered anymore, but—" She trailed off, her hands trembling. James's mind raced. Sensitive projects. That explained why the bag had drawn so much attention, but it didn't explain why it was happening now. He glanced back at the man, who was now typing something on his phone with a smug expression. James realized they were running out of time. Whatever this man was planning, it would unfold before the train reached its final destination. The next station loomed ahead, and the train began to slow. The man in the jacket straightened, slinging his duffel bag over his shoulder. James stepped in front of the elderly woman, shielding her as the train came to a halt. The man moved toward them, his eyes cold and calculating. "Give me the bag, lady," the man said, his voice low but threatening. "You don't want this to get messy." James stepped forward. "She's not giving you anything," he said, his voice steady but firm. The man's smirk faltered, and he glanced around the car. Passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. Phones were out, recording the confrontation. The man gritted his teeth, clearly frustrated. "You have no idea what you're getting into," he hissed. "Maybe not," James said, his voice calm. "But I know you're not getting that bag." For a moment, it seemed like the man would push past James, but then a loud, commanding voice echoed from behind. "Freeze! Hands where we can see them." James turned to see two plainclothes officers entering the train, their badges visible as they advanced. The man in the jacket froze, his eyes darting between them and the duffel bag on his shoulder. One officer moved quickly, grabbing the man's arm and pulling it behind his back. "We've been tracking you," the officer said as he cuffed him. You led us right to her." James exhaled in relief, stepping back to give the officers space. The man glared at him as he was led off the train, but James didn't look away until the doors closed behind them. The train started moving again, and the elderly woman let out a shaky breath. "Thank you," she said softly, her eyes filled with gratitude. James nodded, his heart finally beginning to settle. "You're safe now," he said. But just as he was about to sit down, her bag shifted slightly, and a corner of a folded envelope peeked out. She noticed it too, her face growing pale as she quickly tucked it back in. James frowned. "What is it?" "It's nothing," she said, forcing a weak smile. But James could tell there was more to her story than she had let on. Whatever her late husband had been involved in, it wasn't over. As the train neared its final stop, James leaned back in his seat, his mind racing with questions. He had protected her tonight, but something told him this wasn't the end of it. Somewhere out there, someone else was watching, waiting for another chance to take what was in that bag. And James had a feeling he hadn't seen the last of this fight. As the train slowed to its final stop, James glanced at the elderly woman one last time. She still held her bag close, her fingers curling protectively around the straps. Her breathing had steadied, but her face still bore the weight of whatever secrets that journal held. She offered James a faint smile, one filled with both gratitude and exhaustion. The remaining passengers began to gather their belongings, their murmurs growing louder now that the tension had dissipated. Phones were still out, with some people quietly reviewing the footage they'd captured, but the looks on their faces had shifted. There was no longer the cold detachment of bystanders. Now there was admiration, even respect, for what James had done. Yet James felt no pride, only a sense of relief that the night hadn't ended worse. As the train came to a full stop, the doors slid open, revealing the bustling platform of the station. The elderly woman hesitated, looking at James as if she wanted to say something more but couldn't find the words. Finally, she whispered, "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," James replied, his voice steady. "Just make sure you stay safe." She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then she adjusted her bag and stepped off the train, disappearing into the sea of people on the platform. James watched her go, feeling a mix of emotions, relief, concern, and a lingering curiosity about what was in that journal. Whatever it was no longer his battle to fight. She had to carry that weight now. James stepped off the train himself, the cool night air hitting his face as he emerged from the station. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, people chatting, life moving forward as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the events of the night would stay with him for a long time. It wasn't just about standing up to the man or protecting the woman. It was about the choices people make when faced with injustice. As he walked down the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, half expecting it to be from a friend or even a random number asking for details about what had happened on the train. Instead, it was a notification from one of the news apps. He hesitated before opening it, and sure enough, there it was, a story already spreading online. "Subway hero stands up against thief." The headline made him wince. They had missed the point entirely. James sighed and tucked the phone back into his pocket. He didn't care about being labeled a hero. All he cared about was that the woman had walked away unharmed. The real story wasn't about him. It was about the collective silence in that subway car and how it took one person to break it. He hoped that, if nothing else, the people who had watched the incident unfold would carry something forward. A lesson, a sense of responsibility, a reminder that staying silent isn't always the right choice. He paused at a crosswalk, the hum of the city loud in his ears. His reflection stared back at him from a shop window, tired but steady. Tonight had reminded him of something important. Even small actions could make a difference. Maybe not for everyone, but for someone. As the light turned green, James stepped into the crosswalk, blending into the flow of the crowd. Life went on as it always did, but James knew he wouldn't forget the faces of the people on that train, the fear in the elderly woman's eyes, or the smirk of the man who had thought he could get away with it. He wouldn't forget the moment he chose to act when no one else would. The city lights blurred into the night sky as James disappeared into the crowd, another face in the anonymity of the city. But in his heart he carried the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, for one night, he had made a difference. Sometimes that was all anyone could ask for.